In Mark Winter's world, there was no room for accidents. He believed that chaos was simply a pattern that had not been studied enough. Every morning, as he fixed his tie in the mirror of their large home in Greenwich, he saw more than just a middle-aged man with perfect posture. He saw the architect of his own balanced universe. His life was divided into two separate compartments, and he was the only bridge between them. Connecticut was a place of warmth, the smell of fresh coffee, and Julia's soft voice. Here, Mark was a reliable husband. He never forgot an anniversary and always knew which wine to order for dinner. But as soon as his Tesla crossed the state line toward New York, something inside him changed. Manhattan required a different Mark, sharp, cold, and free from any commitments. Mark called his system the geometry of perfection. His strategy for cheating was a masterpiece of planning. He never used personal credit cards and never visited restaurants within 10 miles of his office. Most importantly, he never allowed himself to get too emotional during work hours. His mistress, Chloe, was part of this schedule with surgical precision. To the rest of the world, she did not exist. She was like a ghost living in a Brooklyn loft. Mark rented this place through a fake company that supposedly stored business archives. In a way, it was true. In that loft, he kept the archives of his second life. On this particular October morning, Mark felt a strange spark of anxiety. He watched Julia fill his travel mug. She moved with a natural grace that had made him fall in love with her years ago. She touched his shoulder and mentioned that he was working too hard on his latest project. She noticed that his eyes looked cold, like steel, as if he were constantly calculating something. Mark gave her his home smile, the one that only moved the corners of his mouth. He told her that in his business, if you stop calculating, you lose. He assured her it was just a difficult month and that everything would be fine soon. At that moment, his internal clock went off. It was 8:15 a.m. It was time to leave. If he was even 3 minutes late, he would hit traffic. That would delay his meeting with Chloe and give him less time to reset his emotions before calling his wife in the evening. Lying required the kind of discipline used by astronauts. His fear was not about morality. Mark did not fear guilt or conscience. He didn't feel them. His only nightmare was a system failure, a stupid mistake, like a forgotten receipt or the smell of someone else's perfume, felt like an intellectual defeat. He despised men who got caught because of simple mistakes. He believed he was smarter than that. During the drive to the city, Mark analyzed his feelings for Chloe. Was it love? No. It was a necessary shot of adrenaline. It allowed him to keep being the perfect husband at home. Chloe was the definition of New York, bold, demanding, and full of ambition. She was his secret mirror. In her, he didn't see a suburban dad, but a predator. However, lately, Chloe had started changing the rules. She asked more questions about his weekends, what he ate for breakfast with Julia, and even the color of the curtains in their bedroom. She was starting to push past the strict hours he gave her. Chloe told him that 3 hours on a Thursday was no longer enough. Mark heard something in her voice that he didn't like, a hint of possessiveness. Entering the underground parking of his office building, Mark looked at himself in the rearview mirror. He checked his cuffs. He was ready for his role. No, somewhere deep in his mind, a thought appeared. Every system, Even a perfect one has a breaking point, and perhaps he was getting close to it. The irony was that Mark saw his life as a fortress. He didn't notice that the walls were already cracking. He didn't know that for 3 months, Chloe had been keeping her own records, a list of his promises, his weaknesses, and his fears. She didn't plan to be an archive file forever. That evening, after a meeting with Chloe that felt more tense than usual, Mark sat in his office looking at the city lights. For the first time, Chloe spoke about a vacation. She suggested Cancun, just the two of them. No work calls, no checking emails, just 1 week. She challenged him, saying that since he was so smart, he could surely find a way to make it happen. He wanted to say no. His rules strictly forbade traveling together. It was the highest level of risk. But at that moment, looking at her challenging smile, Mark made his first serious mistake. He did not reject the idea immediately. He let the idea hang in the air, like a loaded gun that was destined to go off in the final act. If Mark Winter was the architect of his life, then Chloe had become a slow erosion that he mistook for a light breeze. In the weeks after they first discussed the escape to Cancun, Chloe's tactics changed in small, almost invisible ways. She mastered the art of silence, a tool against which Mark's mathematical mind had no defense. She began arriving late to their meetings in the Brooklyn loft. At first, it was only a few minutes, then half an hour. This forced Mark to sit on the cold leather sofa, surrounded by the plain folders that served as his cover. In those moments of waiting, he felt control slipping away for the first time in years. A man whose day was planned down to the second suddenly found himself a prisoner of someone else's mood. Each delay only made him want her more, turning his secret affair into an obsession. When she finally appeared, her presence filled the room with a scent of change. She no longer smelled only of his favorite jasmine. Now, there were hints of rain, wind, and distant roads. In her eyes, Mark saw a silent challenge. She no longer wanted to be a shadow hidden between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Chloe began showing signs of her independence. New clothes he hadn't bought her, and stories of places they had never visited together. She created a feeling of distance, making Mark believe their secret world would collapse if he didn't take a big step. At the same time, in Greenwich, life moved forward, quiet and clear. Julia, full of absolute trust, showed a level of care that now felt to Mark like invisible, choking ropes. Every soft smile and every question about his health made him feel uneasy. She noticed he looked pale and distant, but she believed it was because of his hard work and dedication to the family. A specific tension came from Sarah, the neighbor across the street. She was an element Mark forgot to include in his calculations. Her sudden appearances on the lawn and her watchful eyes over the fence made him feel like his own conscience was watching him in the form of a woman in a tracksuit. One day, when Julia mentioned the neighbor's vacation plans, Mark just nodded. He was too busy calculating his own big lie. He ignored the name of the hotel they mentioned, thinking it was just boring gossip from someone else's life. The turning point came on a cold, rainy Tuesday. Chloe simply did not show up. The empty Brooklyn loft felt like a tomb instead of a hideout. When a short message appeared on his phone about a one-way ticket she had bought, something inside him broke. It was an ultimatum. He had to choose between his safe prison of habits and a dangerous jump into the unknown. The next evening, Mark sat in his office and created a masterpiece of lies. He faked invitations to an international architecture forum, booked hotels through middlemen, and made detailed schedules for speeches he would never give. Each click of the keyboard felt like a hammer, forging his new freedom. As Julia helped him pack, she placed a small silver frame with their photo between his shirts. It was a lucky charm to remind him of home during his business trip. Mark looked at the photo and saw only two strangers frozen in fake happiness. In his mind, he already heard the palm trees of Cancun and felt he had won against his boring life. The trap was set, and Mark, proud of his own intelligence, carefully prepared it himself. He did not know that in the house across the street, Sarah was already closing her suitcase. Inside, she had packed the exact same beach towel that Mark planned to use on the sand at the Azura resort. Tragedy was unavoidable because Mark Winter believed in numbers, but completely forgot about the power of simple chance. The flight to Cancun was like a ritual for Mark. Sitting in his first-class seat, he could physically feel the thousands of miles separating him from Greenwich, from Julia, and from the responsibilities that had weighed on his shoulders for years. Chloe sat next to him, hidden behind large sunglasses. Her silent triumph was almost touchable. This time, she wasn't playing the role of a shadow. In the tropical sun shining through the window, she looked like she was in charge. When they stepped onto Mexican soil, the hot, humid air hit Mark's face like a promise of a new life. The Azura resort was even better than he expected. It was a masterpiece of luxury. Pools that seemed to blend into the horizon, white villas surrounded by green gardens, and a polite staff whose smiles seemed to guarantee that no problems existed here. Mark felt like a general who had successfully finished a dangerous mission. His business trip had started perfectly. On the first evening, he performed a ritual to cut off the past. He turned off his work phone and put it in the safe. He kept only a clean phone to contact home, which he planned to use once a day to report on boring meetings. But even this phone felt unnecessary. In Chloe's arms, with the sound of the ocean waves, he believed he had outsmarted time itself. However, the next morning, the illusion of safety began to show small cracks. It started with something small. During breakfast on a bright terrace, Mark found himself instinctively choosing a table in the corner, behind a large pillar. His brain, trained for years to stay hidden, was still in defense mode even when it wasn't necessary. Chloe, on the other hand, enjoyed being seen. She chose the most visible spots, as if she were teasing fate and Mark himself. Her behavior changed. Away from New York, she was no longer mysterious or distant. Now, she demanded attention every minute. She wanted him to take photos of her against the ocean, take her to the busiest restaurants, and join loud pool parties. For Mark, this was torture. Every time a group of tourists walked by, he would lower his head or hide his eyes behind dark glasses. The paranoia he thought he had defeated came back stronger than ever, turning his paradise vacation into a constant wait for a threat. The strangest thing was the silver picture frame with Julia's photo. Because of a strange impulse or some hidden guilt, he had brought it with him. It lay at the bottom of his suitcase, hidden under clothes, but Mark felt its presence clearly, like a distress beacon. This small object connected him to the world he had betrayed and wouldn't let him fully disappear into the tropical dream. On the evening of the second day, while walking along the torch-lit waterfront, Mark felt his first real moment of panic. In the crowd of tourists, for a split second, he thought he heard Tom's laugh, the loud, friendly laugh of his neighbor that he usually heard over the fence on Saturday nights. Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat. He looked around, but saw only strangers in bright shirts. "It's just an echo of my conscience," he told himself, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. He didn't know that at that very moment, just a few hundred yards away in another wing of the huge resort, Sarah and Tom were finishing their dinner. Sarah, who always had the instincts of a detective, was curiously looking at the hotel guest list on a screen in the lobby, searching for familiar names just out of curiosity. Fate was already pulling the strings together, and the resort, which seemed endless to Mark, was shrinking fast. The tension of this moment was the contrast between the calm Caribbean Sea and the storm inside Mark. He began to realize that the true price of his freedom wasn't money or lies, but a constant, exhausting fear of being recognized. Chloe, noticing his nervousness, only made things worse by making him stay in crowded places. It was as if she were playing her own game to break his self-control. The night before the final meeting was difficult. Mark dreamed of architectural drawings that turned into mazes with no exit, and he heard Julia's voice coming from the deep ocean. He woke up at dawn, before the sun could heat the sand, and felt a strong urge to leave immediately. But logic, his old friend, was silent this time. He stayed, deciding that one more day wouldn't change anything. It was his last mistake. The fourth morning in Cancun began with a silence that made Mark feel suspicious. The sun rose over the horizon, painting the water in the color of melted gold. Through the large windows of the villa, the ocean looked peaceful. But Mark felt a storm growing inside him. His nervous system, sharpened by years of living a double life, was sending distress signals he could no longer ignore. Chloe, on the other hand, was at the peak of her victory. This morning, she insisted on having breakfast at the Grand Veranda, the most open and popular spot in the hotel, with a view of all the main pools. She chose an outfit that was impossible to miss, a bright emerald silk dress flowing in the wind. For her, this was a celebration of her power over his secrets. For Mark, it felt like walking to his execution. Walking down to the terrace, Mark felt like he was moving through a minefield. Every step on the marble stairs echoed in his head like a heavy pulse. He wore the widest hat and the darkest sunglasses he could find in the hotel boutique. He looked like a caricature of himself, a man trying so hard to hide that he became the most noticeable person in the crowd. The terrace was full of laughter, the sound of plates, and the happy talk of tourists. Mark sat with his back to the crowd, trying to disappear in the shadow of a large umbrella. He stared at his plate, studying the fruit as if his life depended on it. But Chloe would not let him vanish. She laughed loudly, pointed at birds, and constantly made him turn toward the light. It was as if she were purposely destroying his last wall of defense. And at that moment, time stopped. The sound that froze Mark wasn't thunder or a scream. It was a familiar, well-known voice saying his name with an emotion that couldn't be faked, a mix of total shock and instant recognition. Mark? Mark Winter? It can't be. He turned his head slowly, like he was in a dream. Only 10 feet away from their table stood Sarah. She was wearing the same straw hat that Julia had given her last summer. Next to her stood Tom, holding 2 glasses of orange juice, with a look of pure, childish excitement on his face. In that short second, Mark saw his whole life like an architectural model that a heavy boot had stepped on. He saw Sarah, whose eyes changed in a fraction of a second from joy to a cold realization. Her gaze moved from Mark to Chloe, who was frozen with a fork in her hand, and then back to him. There were no questions in that look. Sarah was too smart, and the situation was too obvious. The intimacy of the breakfast, the lack of any business files, Chloe's bold beauty, and most of all, the deathly paleness of Mark's face. Tom, who still didn't understand what was happening, took a step forward to pat his neighbor on the shoulder, but Sarah stopped him with a small movement of her hand. The silence between them was louder than any scream. It was filled only with the sound of the waves, which now sounded like mocking laughter to Mark. Sarah didn't make a scene. She didn't shout or ask for explanations. In her world, where loyalty was the foundation, everything was clear without words. She slowly took her smartphone out of her bag. Mark looked at the camera lens like it was the barrel of a gun. He saw her finger move over the screen, the same movement Sarah had made hundreds of times while taking pictures of flowers in her garden or children at parties. No flash was needed. The tropical sun provided perfect light. One short mechanical click, and the digital proof of Mark's shame was sent across the continent. Sarah looked at him one last time. In her eyes, there was no anger, only deep, endless pity for a man who had tried so hard to build a house of cards. They turned and walked away without saying a word. Mark remained in his seat, staring at the ocean, which no longer looked golden. Chloe was saying something, perhaps trying to joke or getting angry, but her voice sounded like it was coming through thick cotton. He knew what was happening in Connecticut at that very moment. He could almost feel Julia's phone vibrating on the kitchen table in their cozy home in Greenwich. He saw her smiling as she picked it up, expecting a vacation photo from her friend, and he saw that smile slowly die, turning into a mask of pain. His perfect geometry was destroyed by one random point on the map. Mark Winter, the master of control, suddenly realized that he hadn't just lost a wife or a reputation. He had lost the only person who loved the real him, and not the perfect plan he had tried so hard to maintain. The journey back from Cancun to New York passed in absolute silence. The airplane, which just a few days ago felt like a portal to freedom, had turned into a cramped metal cage. Chloe sat next to him, but she seemed to be fading away. Without the secret, the intrigue, and the excitement of the forbidden game, she suddenly became just a stranger to Mark, a woman with sharp perfume and cold eyes. Her manipulation had worked. She had pulled him into the light, but in that light, they both looked dull. When Mark landed at JFK Airport, he didn't turn on his phone immediately. He feared the device like a bomb. Only in the taxi, as the gray industrial landscapes of Queens passed by the window, did he decide to press the button. The screen lit up, but he found only emptiness. There were no hundreds of missed calls, No angry messages, no threats. Only one short email from Julia, sent an hour before he landed. The subject line was the address of their home in Greenwich. The body of the email contained only a lawyer's address and one sentence. "The key is under the mat, Mark. I won't be needing it anymore." This short, cold message hit Mark harder than any screaming match. Julia, his sincere, warm Julia, had kept the dignity he never had. Even at the moment of his greatest betrayal, she didn't play his games or ask for explanations. She simply erased him from her reality, like a mistake in a drawing. When the taxi turned onto his familiar street in Greenwich, Mark felt like the town had changed. The houses looked the same and the gardens were still perfect, but everything felt like a stage set. He stepped out at his house. Across the street, in Sarah and Tom's windows, a cozy evening light was burning. He could feel their presence and their silent judgment. Now, in their memories, he would never be a successful architect. He would be a pathetic liar, caught at a breakfast buffet. He found the key under the mat. Inside, the house smelled of lilies, the flowers Julia always kept in the hall. But now, the scent felt like a goodbye. The house was empty, not because the furniture was gone, but because the life had left. Her favorite coat was missing from the rack, and her car keys were not on the table. Mark walked into his office and saw the silver picture frame. Julia had put it back on his desk. He sat in his leather chair and, for the first time in years, had no idea what to do. His analytical mind, which could calculate complex financial schemes and cheating schedules, was useless against the silence of an empty room. He realized that Chloe was right. He was an architect, but everything he had built was just a giant tomb for himself. The lesson finally hit him when he looked in the hallway mirror. He saw a man who was so afraid of losing control that he ended up losing everything worth controlling. His geometry of perfection was just a form of cowardice. He had avoided drama and honest conversations, replacing real intimacy with convenient schedules. Now that the schedules had collapsed, there was nothing left but dust. A week later, Chloe called him, but he didn't pick up. It turned out that their passion lived only on the electricity of the lie. Once the lie was gone, the interest disappeared. She was just a tool he used to punish himself for the boredom of his perfect life. Mark Winter was left alone in his flawless house. He kept going to work, wearing expensive watches and perfectly ironed shirts. But now, as he walked the streets of Manhattan, he no longer felt like a predator. He felt like a ghost. Every time he saw a happy couple or heard a laugh that sounded like Julia's, he understood. Trust is the only material that cannot be fixed if the foundation was built on a lie. The story of his success ended exactly where it began, in the silence of his own mind. He once thought he was the smartest man, but he forgot one simple truth. Truth doesn't have a work schedule, and it always arrives without an invitation, on the clearest and sunniest day.
Do not move. Let the shadow touch first.
At this hour, Venice appeared as a spectral labyrinth carved from damp mist and congealed shadow, where the echo of footsteps upon the stone embankments sounded like the strikes of a metronome, counting down the final moments of Anna's former life. Clutched within her slender fingers was a crumpled envelope of heavy, musk-scented paper, concealing a massive golden key, a symbol of access to a sanctuary long surrendered to oblivion. Before her, the facade of the La Fenice Oscura Theater slowly emerged from the inky stillness of the canal, a majestic and daunting edifice whose vacant window sockets reflected nothing but the cold glimmer of the moon. The heavy oak doors yielded with a reluctant grace, enveloping the young woman in a dry, stagnant aroma of vintage velvet, face powder, and bitter sandalwood that instantly filled her lungs, inducing a faint lightheadedness. Within, a silence reigned so dense that the rustle of her silk cloak seemed a sacrilege, disturbing the peace of the ghosts of the past slumbering in the darkened boxes. Anna took her first step across the worn carpet of the foyer, feeling the theater's cool air cling to her exposed neck like invisible fingers, testing her resolve before she entered this realm of aesthetic decay and hidden desires. The golden key turned in the lock of the central doors with a soft, buttery click, and before Anna yawned the abyss of the auditorium, where gilded moldings flickered feebly in the faint glow of a single lamp positioned at the very center of the stage. As she walked down the center aisle, the sound of her breathing grew increasingly ragged, resonating with the void of the vast space that seemed to greedily observe every curve of her body. Finding herself upon the floorboards, beneath the cone of warm light, she froze, feeling utterly defenseless before an invisible audience lurking in the impenetrable blackness of the tiers. Suddenly, her ears caught the faintest creak of a leather chair and a low, vibrating sound resembling the deep sigh of a man accustomed to the absolute obedience of the world around him. It was no hallucination. In the shadows, behind a heavy brocade curtain, throbbed a foreign, commanding presence that sent a wave of electric chill racing down Anna's spine, forcing her heart to hammer against her ribs with deafening force. She knew that she was not merely being watched, but literally felt by his gaze. This realization of a foreign, dominant will scrutinizing her in the silence awakened a strange, terrifying, and yet sweet numbness within her, forcing her to hold her breath. She stood motionless, feeling the weight of the stranger's gaze become almost physically tangible, as if an invisible palm were gliding over her shoulders, descending toward the line of her spine. Suddenly, from the darkness of the orchestra pit, a thin, dimly shimmering satin ribbon took flight, guided by a steady hand, and fell directly at her feet, snaking across the stage floorboards. Attached to the ribbon was a note written in a calligraphic hand, the ink still retaining a moist sheen. "Your voice is a gift, but your body is an instrument that requires tuning. Let us begin with silence." Anna felt the blood rush to her face, her fingertips beginning to tremble slightly from a mixture of indignation and an inexplicable surge of excitement. She picked up the ribbon, feeling its cool smoothness, and at that very moment, the stage lamp began to fade slowly, plunging the hall into a velvet twilight where the boundaries between reality and fantasy finally began to dissolve. In the ensuing darkness, Anna's senses sharpened to their absolute limit. She could hear the rustle of her own eyelashes and the distant lapping of water in the canal. But most vital of all was the scent, a thick, masculine aroma of expensive tobacco and cured leather that seemed to envelop her in an invisible cocoon. A shadow stirred very close, far nearer than she had expected, and the hem of her dress swayed imperceptibly from the displacement of air caused by someone's swift movement. Julian did not touch her, yet she felt the radiating heat emanating from him, which caused her skin to prickle and her knees to weaken treacherously. He was a master of distance, holding her on the precipice between fear and the burgeoning desire to be the first to reach out, transforming the very anticipation of contact into an exquisite psychological torment. The silence in the hall became so dense that the quickening rhythm of two hearts could be clearly heard, striving against the will of their owners to find a shared, feverish tempo within this derelict temple of art and passion. Julian's silent presence in the stage's gloom felt like an electrified storm front, forcing Anna to freeze in anticipation of the next move in this strange game. Suddenly, from above, out of the tangle of stage rigging and fly galleries, a long strip of the finest transparent silk began to descend slowly, barely visible in the meager light, like the thread of a giant spider. It brushed against Anna's face with the gentleness of a summer breeze, eliciting an involuntary sigh that echoed beneath the theater's vaults, exposing her vulnerability before the unseen puppeteer. A new note, appearing as if out of thin air on a nearby music stand, read, "Close your eyes. Let your senses guide you when sight becomes redundant." After only a moment's hesitation, Anna obeyed, and the world around her instantly shrank to her fingertips and the sound of her own frantic pulse. She felt the silken fabric, guided by skillful movements somewhere on high, begin to wind around her wrists and shoulders, not restricting her movements, but creating an illusion of possession that sent a languid, throbbing warmth spreading through her body. Julian remained in the shadows, yet his influence on the space surrounding her grew increasingly dominant and tangible, transforming Anna's every breath into an act of trust. She felt the cool silk sliding from her shoulders, caressing her skin with such teasing slowness that it felt almost like the physical touch of a man's hands. Every movement of the fabric was calibrated to the millimeter, forcing her to arch her back and tilt her head, exposing her bare neck to the invisible spectator whose gaze she now felt upon her skin like the searing heat of a spotlight. It was a sophisticated tuning of the senses. She was learning to catch the slightest fluctuations in the air and changes in temperature as he moved silently around her, remaining always within arm's reach. At one point, she thought she felt the warmth of his breath right against her ear, and this fleeting, almost ghostly contact caused her heart to skip a beat, plunging her into an abyss of sweet anticipation for the moment when the barrier of silence and space would finally be shattered. Julian led her away from the stage, never touching her hands, yet guiding Anna's movements with the barely audible rustle of his footsteps and brief flashes of light deep within the corridors. They emerged in a rehearsal hall where time seemed to have stood still for a century. The soaring walls were entirely covered by gargantuan mirrors set in silver frames blackened by moisture. In the center of the hall, a dozen heavy candles flickered, their trembling flames multiplying in infinite reflections to create the illusion of a golden labyrinth receding into the very heart of the derelict building. Anna saw herself in every one of these mirrors, fragile, with a feverish glint in her eyes and flushed cheeks. Yet Julian remained naught but a tall shadow gliding along the very periphery of her vision. He stood behind her, and in the mirrored surface she beheld his dark silhouette, faceless, but imbued with such potent animal grace that her breathing instantly became shallow and rapid. She watched, mesmerized, as his black gloved hand slowly rose in the reflection, hovering a mere 2 inches from her shoulder, creating a visual illusion of contact that made her skin sear with imaginary heat. This silent confrontation before the mirrors transformed into a sophisticated dance of self-discovery and seduction, where every one of Anna's movements was duplicated 100-fold, heightening her own sensuality to its limit. Julian forced her to look at herself through his eyes, appraising the fluidity of her body's lines and that particular grace born only from the presence of a powerful man. He repositioned the candles, forcing shadows to play across her collarbones and the curves of her waist, emphasizing the softness of her skin against the rigidity of a corset that suddenly felt far too tight. Within the mirrored labyrinth, the boundaries of her self began to blur. She saw thousands of Annas, each waiting for this invisible barrier of glass and fear to finally collapse under the pressure of the inevitable. When his reflection drew flush against her own, and she glimpsed the flash of his eyes through the slits of his velvet mask, the air in the hall became unbearably thick, steeped in the scent of heated wax and unspoken promise. Anna understood that this play of reflections was merely a prelude, the final step before shadows would take on flesh and their shared hunger an unmistakable form. With a gesture, Julian indicated a narrow door concealed behind a heavy portiere, leading to the theater's most unexpected sanctuary, an ancient winter garden wedged between stone walls and a glass dome shrouded in the nocturnal mist of Venice. Here, far from the dusty wings, the air was heavy and humid, steeped in the intoxicating fragrance of blooming jasmine and rare exotic plants whose broad leaves glistened with dew in the cold moonlight. At the center of this hidden conservatory stood a small marble table. Upon a silver platter lay dark figs, halved to reveal their richness, beside a pair of heavy crystal chalices filled with wine of a thick ruby hue. Obeying a silent sign from the shadows, Anna took a seat on the edge of a stone bench, feeling the chill of the marble contrast with the heat that spread ever more fervently through her veins. She took a slice of fig, sensing its honeyed sweetness and grainy texture, and at that moment, she noticed Julian's shadow fall across the table, stripping her of the last vestiges of her composure. The piquancy of the moment reached its zenith when a drop of transparent juice strayed from her lips and slowly traced a damp path down her chin, coming to rest in the hollow at the base of her throat. Anna froze, not daring to move, as Julian's hand emerged from the gloom, encased in the flawless black kid skin of a glove as soft as a rose petal. With a slow, almost hypnotic motion, he touched her skin, wiping away the damp trail with the tip of his finger. This fleeting contact resonated through Anna's body like a powerful electric charge, causing her breath to falter completely. Julian was in no hurry to withdraw his hand. His fingers slid slightly higher, tracing the line of her jaw with such cautious authority that it felt more intimate than the deepest kiss. The taste of the wine on her tongue, tart and spicy, mingled with the scent of his cologne, a blend of cold sandalwood and warm musk, creating an intoxicating cocktail that sapped her will and left her with but one desire: that this night, filled with forbidden tastes and accidental touches, might never end. The distant tolling of bells from St. Mark's Square heralded the hour when all masks should be cast aside. But within the walls of La Fenice Oscura, the game was only entering its most perilous phase. Julian drew Anna back into the main hall, where the stage was now bathed in a spectral, silvery blue light, reminiscent of the moon's radiance over the lagoon. He did not offer his hand, yet his movement, a barely perceptible inclination of the head and an inviting gesture, was imbued with such magnetic force that Anna followed him as if led by an invisible thread. As they reached the very center of the wooden floorboards, he broke the distance he himself had established for the first time, closing the space between them to mere centimeters. In this daunting proximity, Anna could hear the rustle of his breath and see his pupils dilate within the slits of his mask, reflecting her own turmoil and feverish thirst. No music played in the material world, but the rhythm of their hearts, beating in unison, created that unseen melody to which his hands finally came to rest upon her waist, drawing her toward him with commanding, undeniable certainty. It was a dance of shadows and pulsing passion, devoid of conventional steps or rehearsed paces, where every movement was dictated by pure instinct and the electrified attraction of two bodies. Julian led her with frightening ease, causing Anna to literally hover above the old stage planks, while her fingers, sinking into the heavy velvet of his doublet, sought purchase and found only the heat of his powerful frame. She felt his thigh brush against hers through layers of fabric, felt his palm, having shifted slightly higher up her back, force her to arch toward him like a taut violin string, ready to snap from the unbearable tension. In this silent whirling, the world around them ceased to exist. All that remained was the scent of his skin, the glint of gilded moldings high above, and that crushing sense of possession Julian projected with every gesture. As the dance slowed and he pressed her to him so tightly that she could feel every button on his waistcoat, Anna realized the point of no return had been crossed, and the next chapter of their encounter would unfold where all decorum ends and true obsession begins. Julian slowly drew Anna away from the stage, leading her up a spiral staircase hidden behind velvet draperies to the deepest shadows of the theater, where his private sanctum lay, a box securely shielded from prying eyes. Here, a heavy twilight reigned, broken only by the crimson glow of embers in a small fireplace, which cast dancing shadows upon the walls, transforming the room into something akin to a living, pulsing organism. The air was even denser here, saturated with the scent of fine leather, aged cognac, and that same musky perfume that had now become Anna's sole compass in the world of the senses. Julian gently, yet undeniably, nudged her toward a deep sofa upholstered in forest green satin. There was as much care in the gesture as there was commanding desire. As she sank onto the cool fabric, he finally leaned over her, eclipsing the meager light, and Anna felt her will dissolve entirely in his presence, leaving only a naked thirst for a closeness that could no longer be restrained. The peak of their passion arrived in that very silence they had so carefully preserved throughout the night, rendering every movement an eloquent confession. Julian's hands, still encased in soft gloves, slowly and deliberately explored the boundaries of her body, tracing the curves of her shoulders and waist with such meticulousness it seemed as though he sought to memorize her through the skin of his palms. Every touch sent a tremor through Anna that began in her very heart and rippled outward in waves, forcing her to arch her head back and surrender her neck to his heated breath. The contrast between his strength and her perceived fragility vanished in that moment, replaced by the primal chemistry of two souls who had found one another in a labyrinth of shadows. When his lips pressed momentarily against the pulsing vein at her wrist, Anna felt the tension accumulated over long hours explode within her like a blinding flash, turning their silent union into a triumph of sensuality over reason. In this box, which had become the center of the private universe, there was no longer a master or a muse, only two beings burning in the fire of a mutual and absolute voluntary captivity. The first rays of sunlight, piercing through the morning mist of Venice, found Anna at the moment she slowly stepped out from the heavy theater doors, inhaling the cool, salty air of the lagoon. The night spent within La Fenice Oscura felt now like a fever dream, woven of velvet and suggestion. Yet the pulse in her fingertips and the faint scent of sandalwood upon her skin served as reminders that it had all been real. At the quay, a gondola draped in black fur awaited her. The gondolier, in his traditional hat, stood as motionless as a stone statue, silently gesturing toward her seat in the vessel. Upon the soft cushion, Anna discovered a small parcel. Inside lay that very silk ribbon from the first chapter, and a tiny vial of jasmine oil, accompanied by an unsigned note. The instrument is tuned. Now you are ready to be heard. She pressed the gift to her chest, feeling a new, daunting, and potent strength take root within her, displacing her former fear and uncertainty, a power that could no longer be hidden behind a mask of modesty. The gondola glided smoothly across the mirrored surface of the Grand Canal, past palaces whose facades were just beginning to be tinted with the soft pink hues of dawn. Anna turned back and saw, in one of the upper story windows of the theater, a tall male figure whose stillness betrayed his hidden watch over her departure. Julian did not wave, nor did he attempt to stop her. He simply remained there, her shadow and her patron, confined within his gilded labyrinth until the next night. As the theater finally vanished behind a bend in the canal, Anna closed her eyes, letting the wind brush against her face, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly free. She knew her life would never return to its former course, for in the silence of that derelict hall, she had found not only a patron, but herself, a woman capable of great passion and of an art that knew no boundaries. The city was waking, filling with noise and bustle, but within her, that same shadow chord continued to resonate, marking the beginning of her new, authentic story.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Christina returned home. It was not a return from a journey of leisure or new experiences, but from an expedition into the past, one that had concluded in absolute triumph. Iceland lay behind her now, its harsh, jagged landscapes reduced to mere memories locked in the depths of her mind. She had managed to secure everything she ever desired: the wealth, the property, and the undeniable confirmation of her superiority in a long-standing battle. In her vast, light-drenched mansion, where every object screamed of her impeccable taste and status, a deafening silence took hold. This silence was not merely the absence of sound. It felt dense, enveloping, and suffocating, as if it were draining the oxygen from the room and leaving only a cold vacuum in its wake. The walls that once served as a backdrop for her opulent life now felt like the bars of a golden cage, and every expensive trinket became a reminder of the price paid, not by her, but by others. Christina approached the mirror in her bedroom. Not the small glass used for applying makeup or choosing an outfit, but the massive antique canvas held in a heavy gilded frame that reflected her entire figure. She expected to see the familiar image, the flawless woman whose smile was always cold and confident, whose gaze pierced like a blade, and whose posture spoke of unshakable power. She expected to see a conqueror ascended to the throne of her own ambitions. But instead, deep within the reflection, a frightened girl trembled. Her eyes were too large, her shoulders too frail, and in her expression lived an ancient, lingering fear. The fear of being unwanted, of being forgotten, of being rejected. This fear, it turned out, had been her true engine, the force that drove her down a path of destroying other people's destinies. Her hands, meticulously groomed and accustomed to the touch of expensive fabrics and the cool weight of jewels, suddenly felt stained. Eric's money, now sitting in bank accounts and diversified assets, brought no joy. It felt foreign and searing, like glowing embers against her skin. Every zero on her balance was not a symbol of wealth, but a bloodstain marking her victims. Her entire world, built on the relentless pursuit of control and power, collapsed in a single heartbeat, leaving behind nothing but the shards of an ice mirror reflecting her true, distorted face. The dreams that were once either serene or filled with cold calculations had turned into a form of torture. Insomnia became her constant companion, and when oblivion finally took her, it brought the same recurring images. Over and over, she found herself back on that frigid Icelandic shore, amidst the gray sand and the roaring ocean. Standing before her, as if alive, were Martha and Eric. Their faces were calm, their smiles sincere. They held hands, their eyes glowing with a happiness she had once so ruthlessly trampled. In these dreams, there were no reproaches, no outbursts of anger. There was only a quiet, all-consuming love that existed entirely without her destructive interference. Their peace was her most terrible punishment, for it exposed the full ugliness of her actions, showing exactly how much joy she had stolen and how much pain she had brought into the world of those who had never wished her harm. The realization was like a cold, drenching rain, washing away decades of self-deception. Christina could no longer remain in the mansion, surrounded by dead things that no longer felt like symbols of success, but rather like monuments to her own inhumanity. As she made her decision, she felt like someone voluntarily walking toward the scaffold, not to seek death, but to find rebirth. Every asset, every cent of Eric's money that had scorched her hands was signed away. Not a crumb remained, nor a hint that she had once possessed such a fortune. The vast majority was funneled into foundations for victims of domestic violence, where her name remained anonymous. It was not a gesture of public charity for the sake of image, but a private act of penance, an attempt to redirect the evil she had wrought into a current of good, protecting those who were weak, just as she herself might have once been before she chose a darker path. She kept only a small, humble apartment in a provincial town where she was a total stranger. It was a place where there were no familiar faces, no eyes filled with envy or recognition of her former power. It was a gray, unremarkable corner of the world, far removed from the glitz of capital cities and the luxury of her old life. There, she took a job at a hospice. Until that moment, her entire existence had consisted of beautiful dresses, exquisite galas, intrigues, and manipulations. Now, she was confronted with the naked truth of human fragility, of pain, and of the end. Her hands, which once flicked through glossy magazines and signed high-stakes contracts, now held cups of water for the dying, straightened pillows, and wiped away the tears of those losing their loved ones. The work was grueling, grounded, and bone-tiring, but it was within this labor that Christina found a strange, searing purification. Amidst the pain of others, amidst genuine human tragedies, her social vanity, her arrogance, and her hollow invulnerability finally flaked away like dry husks. The suffering she witnessed was authentic, not imagined, not manufactured. She learned to empathize, not out of politeness, but from the depths of her own wounded heart, her own pain. The unbearable weight of guilt for the harm she had caused became her harshest yet wisest teacher. Every day spent in the hospice, was a lesson in humility, compassion, and the true value of a human life. It was here, far from the glitter and the lies, that Christina began to change slowly, painfully, but irreversibly, allowing the shards of her soul to fuse back together, even if only through scars. In this new, muted world, where days were measured not by profit, but by quiet footsteps along hospital corridors, Christina gradually became a shadow of her former self. Her movements lost their sharpness and authority. Her voice grew softer and her gaze deepened, as if she were constantly listening to something within. It was here, amidst the scent of antiseptics and low-pitched whispers, that she met Thomas. He was a surgeon, a man whose hands fought a daily battle with death. Thomas did not belong to the circles Christina once moved in. There was no polish in his features, only a web of fine wrinkles around his eyes, and the mark of an old, deeply hidden loss. He had survived the death of his wife, and that wound, though scarred over, had made him keen to the sorrow of others. To Thomas, she was not that Christina whose name had once inspired either awe or hatred in high society salons. He saw only a quiet woman with strikingly sad, almost translucent eyes, who knew how to be silent in a way that offered support. Their meetings took place during brief moments of respite over a cup of lukewarm coffee in an empty cafeteria or on a bench in the hospital square, when the twilight blurred the boundaries between past and present. A delicate, almost weightless connection grew between them, devoid of the glitter of manipulation and the games Christina was so used to. It was not a whirlwind romance. Rather, it was the recognition of two broken souls who had found a quiet harbor in one another. Thomas admired her dedication to her work, her ability to sit for hours by a patient's bedside, simply holding their hand. He did not know that this devotion was her form of penance, her way of atoning for the coldness she had once brought into the world. For the first time in her life, Christina felt valued not for what she could provide or how she appeared, but for who she had become in this voluntary silence. This feeling was both terrifying and infinitely warm, like the first spark of a campfire on a freezing Icelandic night. She saw in Thomas a man who had walked through fire and retained his capacity for compassion, and it gave her hope. Perhaps, on the ashes of her own life, something living might one day grow. There came a moment when the silence between Christina and Thomas ceased to be comfortable and became heavy. She realized that their connection, however fragile and beautiful, was built on a foundation of things left unsaid, a foundation that would eventually crumble. Christina knew she had no right to a new life as long as the old one remained hidden in the shadows. This became her personal Iceland, an inner edge of the world where she had to either leap into the abyss of honesty or remain forever trapped in a lie. The fear of losing Thomas was immense, but the fear of once again becoming the person who builds happiness on deception proved stronger. One evening, as the city outside vanished behind a veil of rain, she told him everything. Her narrative flowed slowly, without attempts to justify herself or soften the edges. She laid out the entire truth of what she had done 10 years ago. The cold calculations, the ruined lives of Martha and Eric, her thirst for power, and how deftly she had manipulated the emotions of others. She did not ask for understanding or pity. She simply handed him the truth. Like one returns an old debt, Thomas listened in silence, his face remaining inscrutable, his hands accustomed to the precision of a scalpel lying motionless on the table. When she finished, a silence hung in the room heavier than Icelandic cliffs. Thomas did not leave, but neither did he embrace her. He only asked for time to reconcile how the woman he had grown to love for her kindness could have been the author of such darkness. During this period of waiting, Christina took the final and most vital step on her path to liberation. She sat at her desk and wrote a letter. On the envelope were the names of Martha and Eric. This was not a letter begging for forgiveness. She knew that some things are beyond forgiving. It was a simple, dry admission of guilt and a message stating that she had finally departed from their lives, leaving all claims and grievances in the past. She wrote that she was letting them go, and that her only wish was for them to be happy there. on their own edge of the earth. As she sealed the envelope, Christina felt the invisible chains that bound her to her past triumphs and shames finally loosen. Without this act of recognition, her soul would never have been truly free, even in the deepest exile. Weeks passed before the letter traveled thousands of kilometers to reach that distant rocky shore. There, at the very edge of the world, where the ocean eternally disputes the land, Martha and Eric found the envelope in their mailbox. They read it together, standing by the window of their cozy lighthouse home. In Christina's words, there was no venom, only the bitter truth and a final farewell. That evening, they lit the fireplace. Eric slowly lowered the letter into the flames. The paper blackened, curled, and turned to ash, carrying away the last remnants of an old ache. This was not an act of revenge. It was a ritual of completion. The evil that had once bound the three of them with an invisible thread finally disintegrated, leaving behind only a clean space for a new life. The circle had closed, and the shadows of the past finally dissolved into the salty sea mist. At that very same moment, in a small provincial park, Christina sat on a bench, watching the last rays of the setting sun turn the treetops to gold. She did not know if her letter had been read, but for the first time in many years, a stillness reigned within her. She was no longer waiting for a verdict or searching for excuses. She simply was here and now, accepting the evening chill and the silence of the town. The crunch of footsteps on gravel made her look up. Thomas was walking toward her. His stride was steady, and the gaze he fixed upon her was no longer clouded by shock or doubt. He stopped beside her, and for a heartbeat, the world stood still, holding its breath. Thomas spoke no grand words and made no vows. He simply sat down beside her and covered her hand with his own. That touch spoke more than any confession ever could. He had chosen to stay, accepting her truth and her scars. Christina looked at him, and in her eyes, where once only cold calculation or icy despair had dwelled, a living, warm light flickered. This was not a return to former luxury or a triumphant finale. It was the beginning of a long and quiet journey. She had redeemed herself through voluntary labor, through solitude, and through a ruthless honesty with herself. Now, holding the hand of a man who knew everything about her, Christina realized she too had found her quiet lighthouse, and this dawn was the most beautiful of her life.
The reception hall in the city's finest hotel was suffocating under the scent of expensive perfumes and manufactured grandeur. 10 years later, the faces of her former classmates looked to Martha like masks worn over eroded memories. Crystal chandeliers flooded the room with an aggressive golden light that shimmered in champagne bubbles and reflected off false smiles. Standing at the edge of the balustrade, her slender fingers tightening around a glass, she felt like an intruder in this triumph of vanity. She wore a gown, the color of the midnight ocean, deep blue satin, that rippled softly with every movement, accentuating the paleness of her skin and the fragility of her shoulders. Martha knew they were whispering behind her back. The rumors set adrift 10 years ago had not dissipated. They remained frozen in the minds of these people like flies in amber. To them, she was still the one who had shattered the dreams of the school's most promising boy, the one whose betrayal had become the legend of their graduating class. He appeared in the doorway suddenly, causing the hum of voices to falter for a moment. Eric had changed so profoundly that Martha's breath caught in her throat. The youthful softness was gone, replaced by a cast-iron strength and a strange, haunting detachment. His face, weathered by wind and salt, looked as if it had been carved from dark stone, and the first threads of silver traced through his thick beard, though he was barely 30. He hadn't worn a tuxedo, opting instead for a sharp but rugged blazer over a dark turtleneck, which made him stand out among the polished men in the room like a wolf among pampered hounds. As he adjusted his cuff, Martha caught a glimpse of an old scar on his wrist, the very one he had earned protecting her so long ago. Beside him, clutching his elbow with a proprietary grip, walked Christina. She gleamed in her snow-white dress, as if reminding everyone present who had emerged victorious in that ancient war. Martha watched as Eric's heavy gaze swept the room until it collided with hers. In that instant, time in the golden hall stood still. In his eyes that had once looked at her with infinite tenderness, the ice of the Arctic had now set. It was the look of a man who had long ago buried his heart beneath a layer of permafrost. There were only 10 meters of carpet between them, yet to Martha, it felt like a yawning abyss of lies and unspoken words. Christina, noticing this silent collision, only pressed closer to her husband, casting a triumphant glance over her shoulder at Martha. She knew her deception had worked perfectly. Eric hadn't just left. He had ripped Martha out of his life, leaving nothing but scorched earth in her wake. The air in the hall became unbearably thin, and Martha realized that the silence between them was screaming louder than any music playing that night. Martha could feel Eric's icy gaze burning her skin more intensely than any fire. She moved toward the bar, struggling to maintain an outward composure. Though every step felt laborious, the satin train of her dress heavy, like dragging chains. Near the counter, the air smelled of expensive wood and bitter lemon. Eric was already there, ordering a whiskey. As she drew near, the space between them grew electric. He didn't turn his head, but she saw his broad shoulders tense beneath the fabric of his jacket. Martha ordered a glass of plain water, her voice sounding quiet yet steady. At that moment, Eric set his glass down on the bar with a sharp thud, his fingers long, strong, and marked with the healed cracks of hard labor were for a fleeting second inches from her hand. She felt a wave of heat radiating from him and caught the faint scent of the sea, a fragrance that felt utterly foreign in this stifling hall. It was the scent of freedom and salt, the scent of the man she had once known and loved beyond reason. The silence between them was broken only by the clinking of ice in his glass. Finally, Eric turned, and Martha saw his eyes up close. There was no hatred in them, only a deep, scorched emptiness that wounded her even more. He looked at her as if she were a ghost from a forgotten nightmare, rather than the woman to whom he had once promised the world. He didn't utter a word, but his gaze slowly traced her face, lingering on her lips, and Martha felt the touch almost physically. In that silence, everything was laid bare. The bitterness of their final quarrel, the weight of 10 years apart, and the shadow of the lie that had poisoned their lives. Suddenly, Christina approached. Her laughter, high-pitched and artificial, sliced through the quiet like a scalpel. She rested her hand on Eric's shoulder, flaunting the large diamond on her finger, and addressed Martha with a voice full of feigned sympathy, asking about her difficult life. Martha didn't offer a reply. She watched as Eric gave a nearly imperceptible flinch at his wife's intrusive presence, yet he still allowed her to lead him away toward the dancing couples. Left alone, Martha stepped out onto the balcony to breathe in the cool night air. There, concealed by the shadow of heavy drapes, she unwittingly became a witness to a conversation. Christina and an old friend of hers stood a short distance away, unaware of Martha's presence. Through the gloom came words that changed her world forever. Snickers about how easy it had been to forge those messages and send the anonymous photos. How simple it was to convince the proud Eric of his beloved's infidelity. Christina boasted of her mastery, of manipulation, calling it the price of her happiness. In that instant, Martha felt something inside her finally snap. Pain was replaced by a cold, crystal-clear resolve. She was no longer a victim of their intrigues. Now she possessed the truth. And that truth demanded not excuses in a stifling ballroom, but an honest confrontation where lies cannot survive in the frozen heart of his new home. A month later, Martha sat behind the wheel of an SUV, slowly navigating through a thick Icelandic fog. The landscape outside her window resembled another planet. Endless fields of frozen lava, carpeted in emerald moss, gave way to jagged cliffs and icy rivers. The air here was so pure, it felt foreign to her lungs. She had left everything behind: her job, her cozy apartment, the clamor of the city, taking with her only a single suitcase, and the truth that seared her heart. The road snaked along the coastline, where the raging Atlantic Ocean crashed its leaden waves against black sands with a thunderous roar. Martha felt the urban bustle shedding off her with every passing kilometer. Like old, dry skin, she was searching for the Reykjanes lighthouse, the place Eric had turned into his bastion of solitude. The closer she drew, the more violently the wind rocked the car, as if nature itself were warning her that there was no turning back to the past. The lighthouse appeared on the horizon, like a slender white finger pointing toward a somber sky. It stood at the very summit of a cliff, buffeted by all the winds, surrounded only by screaming gulls and the rumble of the surf. Martha parked the car at the base and stepped outside. The icy wind struck her face instantly, whipping strands of hair out from under her hood and making her eyes water. She breathed in deeply the scent of salt and wet stone. Here, everything was real, stripped of the glitter and falsehood of that night at the hotel. Before her lay a path leading to the heavy wooden door of the lighthouse. Martha knew Eric was in there, behind those thick walls, hiding from the world that had betrayed him. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the ocean waves. She did not know if he would welcome her or drive her back into the fog, but she was ready for any storm. She began her slow ascent up the trail, feeling the firmness of the ancient earth beneath her feet, knowing that this journey was the only thing in her life that truly mattered. The heavy door of the lighthouse didn't yield at first, as if resisting an intrusion from the outside world. When Martha finally stepped inside, she was greeted by the scent of old wood, hearth smoke, and strong coffee. It was surprisingly warm within. The thick stone walls reliably muffled the roar of the wind, reducing it to a dull, monotonous hum. Eric stood at a massive table, cluttered with maps and blueprints. He didn't turn around immediately, likely mistaking her for one of the local suppliers. But as the silence stretched thin, he slowly raised his head. In the dim light of the room, his silhouette appeared even more imposing. He wore a heavy sweater of coarse Icelandic lopi wool that made him look like an extension of the cliffs themselves. When their eyes met, the cup in his hand froze mid-air. The astonishment on his face was quickly replaced by a familiar mask of severity, and his eyes narrowed into two cold slits of steel. He didn't take a single step toward her. The silence was broken only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the distant cry of a petrel outside the window. Eric set his cup on the table with a hollow thud and crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for an explanation. Martha stood at the threshold, feeling droplets of icy water drip from her raincoat onto the stone floor. In her city clothes, pale and shivering, she looked entirely out of place. Yet there was a firmness in her posture that he didn't remember. He spoke first. His voice was low and hoarse, unaccustomed to prolonged conversation, vibrating in the air like a roll of distant thunder. He asked what she was doing there, and there wasn't a drop of hospitality in the question. Martha took a step forward into the circle of light from a single lamp, a gesture that felt like a declaration of war or the beginning of a long-awaited peace. She didn't ask for permission to enter or apologize for the intrusion. Martha simply unbuttoned her coat, allowing herself to warm up slightly. She looked directly at him, noting every new line around his eyes and the tightness of his jaw. The tension in the room became almost tangible, thick as an Icelandic fog. She replied that she hadn't traveled 3,000 kilometers just to stand in a doorway, and that they had a conversation 10 years overdue. Eric gave a short, bitter chuckle, glancing at the window where the sky was rapidly bruising into a leaden blue. He walked to the window and slid the heavy iron bolt shut, effectively sealing the two of them inside this stone cocoon. The storm he had predicted by the wind's shift finally struck the walls of the lighthouse with such force that the entire structure shuddered. They were now cut off from the rest of the world, trapped alone with their truth. The evening dissolved into a deep, impenetrable night. Outside, the storm had unleashed its full fury. Waves struck the cliff, with such violence that sea spray reached the upper windows of the tower. Inside the lighthouse, the only source of light was the fireplace, its amber flames casting long, grotesque shadows against the stone walls. In silence, Eric motioned Martha toward a chair by the fire and handed her dry clothes, a massive man's shirt made of thick flannel. It carried his scent, pine needles, and pure, sharp cold. She withdrew to a small alcove behind a screen to change, and the rustle of fabric against her skin seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. When she returned and sat by the fire, pulling her knees to her chin, he sat opposite her in the shadows. Only the flickering embers occasionally caught his watchful, heavy gaze. He observed her warming her hands, and the initial rage in his silence had vanished, replaced by the wary anticipation of a predator that senses danger but cannot look away. Between them sat a chessboard with an unfinished game, likely one he had been playing against himself. Martha reached out and moved one of the pieces, disrupting his perfect order. The gesture served as a signal. She began to speak. At first, her voice trembled, eclipsed by the howl of the wind in the chimney. But gradually, it grew steady. She spoke of that night 10 years ago, of the letters he had never received, and of the words Christina had whispered into his ear while he was blinded by pain. Eric listened without interruption, his face a motionless mask, but Martha saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. Every word she uttered fell into the stillness of the room, like a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. She offered no excuses. She was simply returning to him the fragments of reality that had been stolen from his life. When she finished, a silence so profound settled over the room that one could hear the ash settling in the hearth. Eric rose slowly and walked toward her. He stopped, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. In the gloom, his silhouette eclipsed all light, and for a moment, Martha felt a flicker of fear, not of his anger, but of the raw power of the emotions awakening within him. He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from her cheek. She saw the struggle within him, his pride colliding with the realization of a monstrous mistake. In his eyes, the ice began to fracture, revealing a raw, unbearable ache beneath. He did not touch her, but that unmade contact was more intimate than any kiss. The air between them turned hot, almost searing, and in that space at the edge of the world, the old lies finally burned away, leaving behind nothing but a pure, primal attraction. The storm did not subside. It merely traded its fury for a monotonous, heavy siege. Eric stepped away from Martha and moved to a small escritoire, fishing out a crumpled pack of cigarettes he kept only for nights like this. Martha asked about Christina, a short question that hung in the air, like a heavy lead weight. Eric chuckled, and there was more exhaustion in the sound than malice. He explained that their marriage was nothing more than a stage set that suited them both. Christina had her status and the bank accounts he diligently filled, and in return, he had earned the right to solitude here among the cliffs, where no one demanded smiles or words of love. She never came to Iceland. To her, the island was a frozen hell, while to him, it had become the only place where the silence did not feel like a lie. Martha realized then that all these years, he hadn't just been living apart, he had been punishing himself with this exile, believing he deserved nothing but the cold and the salt. The words about Christina finally shattered the last remains of awkwardness. There was no longer a third party in the room, only two people who had once been everything to one another. Eric walked to the hearth and tossed a few logs of ocean-bleached driftwood into the fire. The flames flared with renewed strength, illuminating his face. He confessed that every morning, as he watched the churning ocean, he saw her face in the foam of the waves, and that vision was his personal curse. He had hated her for her betrayal, but he hated himself even more for never being able to purge her from his blood. Now that the truth was laid bare, the hatred accumulated over 10 years began to transform rapidly into something else, a hunger that could no longer be concealed. His gaze grew heavy, He no longer hid the desire that pulsed in time with the waves crashing against the cliff. Martha stood up, her shadow flickering against the wall. She stepped toward him until the toes of her borrowed boots brushed against his heavy ones. In the cramped intimacy of the lighthouse, amid the scent of smoke and the rising heat of the fireplace, social conventions ceased to exist. She reached out and touched the scar on his wrist, the one he had received in their youth. Her fingers were cool, but his skin was searing. This first conscious touch acted like an electric shock. Eric exhaled sharply, his palm covering her hand, pressing it against his body. He looked down at her with a tenderness so fierce it made Martha's head spin. In this gesture lay everything: the bitterness of a lost decade and the promise that this night would be their redemption. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in, leaving room for no one but the two of them. The tension that had accumulated over long years finally reached its zenith, but now its very nature had shifted. Eric took a step toward her, a movement as profound as the shifting of tectonic plates. He did not touch her immediately, but Martha felt the space between them thicken, becoming hot and visceral, like molten wax. His breath, ragged and heavy, brushed against her temple, and the scent of salt and fire-warmed wood enveloped her, stripping away her will to resist. In the flickering light of the hearth, his silhouette appeared monumental, when his hand, large, calloused, and accustomed to rough labor, finally came to rest upon her neck. Martha felt a jolt of searing recognition surge through her body. It was the touch of a man who had found a treasure he believed was lost forever. He slowly traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, compelling her to lift her head and meet his gaze. There was no more ice in his eyes, only a bottomless, dark tenderness and a silent question, to which she responded by leaning forward ever so slightly. Their closeness in this moment was devoid of haste. It was like the slow dance of shadows upon the stone walls of the lighthouse. Eric gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and that simple movement in the silence of the room resonated louder than any confession. The flannel shirt, too broad in the shoulders, rustled softly as he drew her to him, closing the final millimeters that separated their two worlds. Martha pressed her cheek against his chest, listening to the hollow, powerful thud of his heart, which echoed the rhythm of the ocean surf outside the window. They sank onto a wide armchair, draped in heavy furs, remaining within the golden circle of light from the dying embers. The entire scene was built on contrasts: the softness of her skin beneath his rough fingers, the fragility of her silhouette within the ring of his powerful arms. The moments focused on micro-movements, the way their fingers interlaced, how his lips barely grazed her forehead and closed eyelids, and how she caught her breath with every exhale he made. This was passion translated into the language of gestures and tactile sensations. In every movement, there was a sense of redemption for the years of separation. Outside the lighthouse walls, the elements raged, but here, in this cocoon of warmth and truth, time slowed down, turning their embrace into a quiet harbor where two broken hearts finally began to beat in unison, healing one another without a single word. The flames on the hearth had collapsed into a heap of shimmering embers, veiled by a thin layer of gray ash. The silence that had descended upon the lighthouse after the storm was almost tactile outside the walls. The ocean had traded its furious roar for a weary, rhythmic murmur. In the pre-dawn twilight, the room filled with a cold, bluish light that fell softly upon the heavy folds of the blankets and the interlaced hands of the two figures. Martha lay still, feeling the steady, deep rise and fall of Eric's breath. His palm still rested on her shoulder, as if even in sleep he was guarding her presence, fearing that the dawn might prove to be nothing more than another mirage. In this hour, before the world outside had regained its sharp edges, the past, the noisy halls, Christina's caustic laughter, and the years spent in the concrete jungle seemed distant and unreal, like the stage sets of a movie watched long ago. Eric opened his eyes suddenly, with the alertness of someone whose life has depended for years on the fickle moods of the elements. He did not pull away. Instead, he drew Martha closer, searching her face in the gloom. In his gaze, now stripped of its protective armor of severity, lay a quiet wonder. He slowly traced the tips of his fingers along her arm, as if testing whether the skin beneath his touch was truly so warm and alive. This night had done more than just return them to one another. It had erased a decade of distance, reducing it to nothing. He understood that beyond the threshold of the lighthouse, the real world awaited them with its complex decisions and legal entanglements. But here and now, in this stone cocoon at the edge of the earth, only one truth existed. They were no longer alone in their exile. Martha turned toward him, and in the morning dusk, her eyes looked like dark lakes brimming with hope. She asked no questions about the future, for the answer was written in every one of Eric's movements, in the tender way he touched her hair. Outside, the dawn began to stain the horizon with soft pink and golden hues, piercing through the remnants of the fog. This light was mercilessly honest. It laid bare the fine lines around his eyes and the paleness of her face. Yet, in this nakedness of emotion, there was an authentic beauty that no silks or gold could ever replace. Eric brushed her forehead with a brief, almost weightless kiss that became a silent vow. They lay in silence, listening to the island wake up, as the ash in the fireplace finally cooled, giving way to a new day that promised to be the first of their new, shared life. Morning had fully asserted its rights by the time they stepped out onto the lighthouse's narrow terrace. The air was bitingly cold, and so translucent that it felt as though one could see the very edge of the world. Below, the black sand of the beach lay perfectly smooth after the storm, gleaming like obsidian beneath a thin veil of water. The ocean, which only recently had tried to crush the cliffs, now humbly licked the shore, leaving behind laces of white foam and tangled ribbons of kelp. Eric stood by the railing, baring his face to the sharp northern wind. He was back in his coarse wool sweater, looking like an inseparable part of this landscape. Martha followed, wrapping herself in his jacket, which smelled of tobacco and freedom. She gazed at this wild, primordial land and, for the first time in her life, felt that she was exactly where she belonged. They began their descent down the steep, winding path leading to the foot of the cliff. Every step on the damp earth and moss required effort, but Eric led the way, always ready to offer a shoulder or reach out a hand. When they reached the black beach, the silence here proved to be of a different kind, filled with the powerful roar of the surf. They walked along the tide line, past twisted driftwood and shards of blue ice cast ashore by the storm. These icy monoliths sparkled in the sun like massive, uncut diamonds. The walk felt like a ritual of catharsis. Icy spray stung their skin, and the wind swept the last remnants of doubt from their minds. Martha picked up a smooth black stone from the sand, polished by millennia, and felt its weight as substantial and real as their feelings. Eric stopped at the water's very edge and turned to her. He spoke of how life here would not be easy. Iceland does not forgive weakness, and his past still trailed behind him like a long shadow. But looking into his eyes, Martha saw no fear, only a readiness to meet any challenge. She stepped close, and they stood motionless against the backdrop of an infinite horizon where the leaden sky merged with the ocean. In this place, stripped of urban clamor and the whispers of others, everything had become profoundly simple. The truth she had carried with her across half the world had finally found its soil. She knew that their story was only beginning. It was no longer a fairy tale of love, but a saga of two people who had proven stronger than their own fate. The idyll of the lull was shattered on the third day, when the sky over the coast became unnaturally clear and the ocean settled into a mirror-like stillness. The sound of a foreign engine sliced through the coastal silence suddenly and sharply, like the screech of metal on glass. At that moment, Martha and Eric were on a small pier, helping each other secure the rigging on an old boat. When a white SUV appeared on the crest of the hill, Eric froze, his face instantly transforming into the stone mask Martha had seen the night of their first reunion. The vehicle came to a halt, and Christina stepped out. She looked absurd in her pristine white fur coat and high-heeled boots, which immediately began to sink into the soft black sand. Her presence here felt like a toxic stain on the clean canvas of the Icelandic landscape. She walked toward them, her eyes contemptuously surveying the weathered walls of the lighthouse and the rusted chains of the pier. Every movement she made was infused with a rage, carefully disguised as social arrogance. Christina had not expected to find Martha here, so close to Eric, and when their eyes met, a flash of hatred ignited in the wife's gaze, a malice that could no longer be hidden behind a fake smile. She began speaking from a distance. Her voice, usually melodic, now sounded harsh and shrill, punctuated by the roar of the surf. She accused Eric of madness, of trading their status for this wasteland, and of allowing that woman to desecrate their lives once more. Christina was certain of her power over him, believing the old threads of lies and legal obligations still held a firm grip on his throat. Eric did not utter a single word until she stood directly before him. He simply stayed there, his hand resting on Martha's shoulder, a calm, protective gesture that infuriated Christina more than any verbal insult could have. When she finally fell silent, gasping from the cold air and her own fury, Eric looked at her as if he were seeing a complete stranger. There was no resentment in his gaze, no urge to argue, only an endless exhaustion from the long comedy he had been forced to perform. He spoke only one sentence, quiet but heavy as the strike of a hammer. He told her she was 10 years too late, and that here, on this shore, her words no longer carried any weight. He looked at her not as a wife, but as a tedious nuisance that prevented him from breathing freely. Infuriated, Christina tried to strike where it hurt most. She began once again to speak of Martha's betrayal, shouting out the old details of that fabricated lie. But this time, the script did not go according to her plan. Martha stepped forward, moving out from behind Eric's shoulder. She did not scream, and she did not cry. With icy composure, she recounted the very words she had overheard on the balcony. During the reunion, every word Christina had uttered about the forged letters and the manipulations. In the silence of the Icelandic shore, this confession rang out like a death sentence. Christina faltered for a moment, her face blooming with crimson splotches as her carefully constructed image of wronged virtue began to crumble, exposing the shallow, frightened soul of a woman who had built her happiness upon the misery of others. Eric turned slowly toward Christina. Now, in his eyes, there flared the same flame Martha had seen in the heart that night, but this was a fire of purification. He did not cause a scene. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a ring of keys, and placed them on the weathered planks of the pier. It was a gesture of final severance, not just from her, but from the entire world she personified. He told her she could take it all: the house, the accounts, the cars, everything she had clung to so desperately. He no longer needed that alibi for his solitude. Christina looked at the keys, then at Martha, and for the first time, a flash of total realization crossed her eyes. She understood that no amount of money and no web of lies could restore her power over a man who had found the strength to forgive and to love once more. Christina left as abruptly as she had appeared. She almost ran back to her car, stumbling over the stones and never looking back. When the sound of her SUV finally died away in the distance, silence reigned over the shore once more. But now it was crystal clear. Eric and Martha remained on the pier, gazing out at the boundless ocean. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if a weight of many tons had just been lifted from them. He turned to Martha and took her face in his palms. His fingers still smelled of salt and aged timber, but now there was an absolute, boundless freedom in his touch. The past was officially over. Here, amid the ice and the black sand, they were left alone to begin writing their own story. A story where shadows no longer had a place. After Christina's departure, the lighthouse seemed to exhale in relief. A few weeks passed, and the harsh Icelandic winter began to slowly assert its dominance, blanketing the lava fields in a thin layer of crisp frost. Martha and Eric's lives settled into a measured rhythm dictated by nature itself. Mornings began with thick fog creeping in from the ocean and the scent of freshly ground coffee mingling with the aroma of juniper in their cozy kitchen. They no longer looked back. All legal documents had been sent by mail, all bridges burned, and the ash of old grievances finally scattered over the Atlantic. Now, their world was bounded only by the circle of light, from the lighthouse lens and the warmth of each other's hands. In this seclusion, Martha found a new purpose for her art. Her sketches on black paper, rendered in white charcoal, captured the soul of this land better than any words ever could. They spent their evenings in the tower's upper gallery, where the massive lantern rotated slowly, slicing through the nocturnal gloom with a powerful golden beam. Eric taught Martha the subtleties of the mechanics, how to listen to the pulse of this great machine, how to read the language of the clouds, and how to predict the onset of snowstorms. In these moments, a rare harmony reigned between them, the kind born only after great trials. They could sit for hours in silence on a narrow bench, gazing at stars that seemed so low one could reach out and touch them. This silence held no emptiness. It was filled with the realization that they were finally home. Every accidental brush of shoulders, every exchange of glances in the dim light of the gallery was a confirmation of their unspoken covenant, a union of two people who chose the truth over a comfortable lie. One night, when the sky above the cliff erupted in emerald flashes of the northern lights, they stepped out onto the open balcony just beneath the lantern. Green and violet ribbons of light danced over the ocean, reflected in the dark pupils of Eric's eyes. He embraced Martha from behind, shielding her from the piercing wind within the folds of his heavy coat. This gesture contained his entire essence, the protector, the guardian, the man who had found his lost harbor. Martha pressed against him, feeling the icy air sear her lungs, while her heart overflowed with an incredible warmth. She knew there would be long winters ahead, storms that would cut them off from civilization and grueling labor. But looking at that celestial fire, she understood. The storm in his blood had finally stilled, transforming into the steady, eternal flame of the lighthouse that would guide them for the rest of their lives.
Mark sat by his workshop window, and that evening, the city lights seemed especially dim. Every speck of dust dancing in the lamp's light felt like a fragment of lost time. It had been a month since Elena flew away. A month without her laughter, without her habit of leaving half-finished cups of tea everywhere, and without her warm hand gripping his during their walks. The workshop, usually filled with the scent of old wood and paper, now smelled only of memories. He looked at his tools, fine brushes for restoration and stacks of ancient books waiting for a master's touch. Before, Mark would tell Elena about the secrets hidden in yellowed pages, and she would listen with her chin in her hand, her eyes shining. Now his stories remained untold, and the silence of the workshop felt heavy. Since the day Elena's plane left the runway, his world had shrunk. Every morning began with checking his phone. Every evening ended with a short video call. Elena talked about her internship in Paris, her new friends, and how the city's energy captured her heart. Mark saw her glowing eyes and heard her excitement. He was happy for her, but behind every happy word and every photo of her at the Eiffel Tower, he felt a growing emptiness. He noticed tiny changes. Her hair was styled differently, and there was a new confidence in her gaze. She was blossoming, and while that made him proud, it also frightened him. A distance was growing between them, not just physical, but something invisible. He imagined her walking the streets of Paris while he remained stuck among his old books. Sometimes, Mark looked through their old photos, trying to hold on to the past. There they were, laughing at a picnic, or Elena sleeping on his shoulder during a train ride. Each photo was a portal to a time when they were inseparable. He didn't just miss her, he missed their life together and the feeling of home she brought with her. His fingers slid across the screen, and he felt a wave of sadness. It was more than just boredom. It was a feeling that a part of him was slowly fading away without her. He tried to bury himself in work, but even the most complex mysteries of the past could not distract him from the main puzzle of the present. how to live without her when she was so far away. One day, while scrolling through his social media feed, Mark saw a photo of Alina. She was standing next to a beautiful bouquet of bright yellow roses. The caption mentioned an unexpected gift from a charming Parisian. Mark's heart sank. He knew Alina was friendly, but this charming Parisian felt like a wrong stroke in their beautiful painting. It wasn't simple jealousy, it was a sense of loss. The realization that his place in her life could be taken by someone else. He put his phone down and looked out the window. It was raining, and the outlines of the houses were blurring. Everything felt as uncertain as his own feelings. A thought was born in his head, scary at first, but soon it took over his mind completely. The idea became an obsession. He imagined her face, her surprise, and her joy. He imagined closing the distance between them without waiting another day. It was madness for someone as careful and logical as Mark. He never made impulsive decisions. His life was always planned down to the last detail. But now, looking at his reflection in the dark window glass, he saw a man ready to challenge his own nature for a single moment of happiness. He couldn't just wait anymore. He couldn't settle for short calls and digital photos. He needed to see her, feel her presence, and make sure their story wouldn't disappear in the Parisian air. For a few days, Mark lived like he was in a dream. He secretly checked flight schedules and the location of Alina's hotel. Every click of the mouse felt like a step toward the inevitable. It was like restoring a masterpiece, careful work, but with the thrill of something wonderful. He canceled his meetings and made up excuses so no one would suspect his disappearance. Inside him, caution fought with desperate desire. But desire won. He knew this act would either strengthen their bond or break it forever. Still, something told him it was the only right way. He bought a one-way ticket, feeling dizzy with the realization that there was no turning back, only forward to her. The airport greeted Mark with the hum of thousands of voices and the blinking of flight boards. Holding a small travel bag, he felt like a smuggler carrying his most precious possession, hope. As the plane lifted off, Mark felt a strange lightness. The city below turned into a sea of lights and then vanished under the clouds. At that moment, he realized there was no return. This hill's whole world narrowed down to an airplane seat and the roar of the engines. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine Paris, but his mind only showed him Alina's face. How much had she changed? Would his visit be too much for her? The clouds outside the window looked like the pages of the unopened books he loved so much. Mark thought about how relationships are also a form of restoration. Sometimes you need to remove the dust, fix the cracks, and bring back the bright colors. He pulled an old movie ticket from his pocket, their first date, a small piece of paper he kept as a lucky charm. It was ironic. A man who spent his life preserving the past was now flying toward an unknown future. Fear and excitement mixed in his chest, making his head spin. When the wheels touched the ground in Paris, Mark's heart beat in rhythm with the city. The airport smelled of expensive perfume and fresh coffee. Walking out of the terminal, the cool morning air hit his face. This was her city's air. Mark caught a taxi, and as the car drove through the outskirts, he stared hungrily at the landscape. He was finally in her reality, and only a few kilometers stood between them. Paris in the morning light looked like a set from an old movie. Narrow streets, iron balconies, and endless rows of attic windows. The taxi dropped him off at a quiet square in the Latin Quarter, near Elena's hotel. Mark decided not to go to her immediately. He needed time to breathe and become part of this space. He went into a small bakery, bought 2 croissants, and sat on a bench in a small park across from her hotel. The hotel was called L'Horizon, an old building with a heavy oak door and flowers on the windowsills. This was where he first saw Monsieur Henri. The old man was sitting at a tiny table near the entrance of his flower shop, which was right next to the hotel. He was slowly drinking espresso and writing in a notebook. Mark couldn't help but stare. There was something calming about Henri, a kind of ancient wisdom. When their eyes met, the old man gave a small nod, as if he recognized a fellow traveler searching for meaning. Mark felt that this man would be a witness to the most important moment of his life. Suddenly, sitting on the bench, Mark saw what he feared most. Elena walked out of the hotel. She looked beautiful in a light coat, her hair falling over her shoulders. But she was not alone. Walking beside her was a tall man, the charming Parisian from the photos. They were talking animatedly, and the man held her elbow as they crossed the street. Mark felt the ground move beneath his feet. His plan suddenly seemed foolish. He wanted to call out her name, but his voice was gone. He just watched them disappear around the corner, leaving him alone with his doubts and his heavy bag. After Elena disappeared with her companion, Mark sat frozen on the bench. All his courage and the excitement of traveling thousands of miles vanished, replaced by a cold emptiness. The Paris air, which felt so alive a moment ago, now seemed cold and indifferent. He felt like an uninvited guest at someone else's party. Monsieur Henri, still sitting by his flower shop, seemed to notice nothing, Or perhaps he saw everything and chose to stay silent. Mark felt a sharp sting of shame. What if she wasn't the same Alina anymore? What if he had made the biggest mistake of his life? He stood up and walked down the street without a destination. He saw shop windows full of cheese, smelled fresh bread, and heard children laughing in the park. This was the Paris Alina loved, but he felt he didn't belong here. He stopped by the Seine River, watching the boats go by. The city didn't care about his personal drama. For a moment, he thought about going back to the airport and disappearing as if he had never come. It would be the easy way out, a way to escape the pain of disappointment. But then, Mark remembered Alina's face during their last video call. He remembered the slight sadness in her eyes that she tried to hide. He remembered her talking about how hard it was to be in a busy new city. Maybe what he saw was just the surface of her new life. He had no right to judge without knowing the truth. This thought became his anchor. He had to see her eyes and hear her voice to know if their story was really over. He couldn't leave without trying. It would be a betrayal of everything they had built. He had to fight for their future, even if it made him look foolish. Mark returned to L'Horizon around noon. He found a cozy bar across the street, ordered a coffee, and sat where he could see the hotel entrance. Monsieur Henri was still there, now simply watching the people pass by. Mark decided to find out who that man was. With a racing heart, he checked Alina's social media again. He saw new photos of her alone, but then he found the one with the yellow roses. The caption read, "Thank you to my mentor, Monsieur Dubois, for the priceless advice and the beautiful flowers." At that moment, Mark noticed another photo of Alina posing by Henri's flower shop with the same bouquet. Everything became clear. Monsieur Dubois was a mentor, likely a professor or a supervisor, and the flowers were probably from Henri's shop. Mark felt the heavy tension leave his body. He looked up and met Monsieur Henri's eyes. The old man smiled and nodded slightly, as if he knew what Mark was thinking. It was a kind smile, full of understanding. Mark realized that Henri had been watching his struggle from the beginning, a silent witness in his quiet corner. A new wave of determination hit Mark. He knew now that his fears were wrong. Alina might have changed, but she hadn't given up on their love. He pulled out his phone. His fingers shook as he dialed her number. This was the moment he had traveled so far for. The call connected. He heard her sleepy, surprised voice. "Hello. Did you forget something?" she asked. Mark took a deep breath. "Look out your window," he said quietly. There was silence on the other end of the line. It was so thick that Mark felt he could hear Alina's heart beating from across the street. He stood on the sidewalk looking up, ignoring the people walking past him. The world stopped. The cars went silent, the wind died down, and even Monsieur Henri stopped working, waiting for what would happen next. A curtain moved in a third-floor window. A hand pushed the fabric aside, and then Alina's face appeared. She squinted against the bright Parisian sun, shading her eyes with her hand. Mark didn't move. He just stood there in his wrinkled coat, his bag at his feet, feeling like the most ridiculous and the happiest man in the world. When she finally saw him, her expression became something Mark would never forget. First, there was total confusion. Her brain couldn't believe her eyes. Then her eyebrows shot up, her mouth opened in a silent gasp, and her whole face lit up with pure, honest joy. In that moment, all the doubts and all the fear of French mentors vanished. The distance that seemed like a giant canyon closed in a single second. Alina disappeared from the window, and a moment later, the heavy hotel door swung open. She ran out into the street, not even stopping to put on a coat. She ran toward him, ignoring the puddles on the pavement. When she crashed into him, Mark almost fell over. He breathed in the scent of her hair, the familiar smell of lavender mixed with something new and Parisian. They didn't say a word. Words were too simple for what they were feeling. Monsieur Henri, who had been watching the whole time, slowly stood up. He went into his shop and came back out holding a single rose, not yellow like the ones from the mentor, but a deep velvet red. He walked over to them and silently handed the flower to Mark. His eyes showed the approval of a master looking at a perfectly restored piece of art. Mark took the rose and gave it to Alina. The mystery of the other man was gone. The old florist had simply been looking after a lonely girl, seeing in her the same spark that Mark loved so much. They sat in a small cafe in the corner, and Alina talked non-stop about how much she missed their evening conversations. It turned out that Monsieur Dubois was a 70-year-old professor who reminded her of her grandfather, and the flowers were just a polite gift for her hard work. Mark listened, and the silence inside him finally felt peaceful. He realized that his trip wasn't about a lack of trust. It was an act of keeping their love real in a world that tries to pull people apart. That evening, as the sun set and turned the roofs of Paris to copper, Mark and Alina stood on her balcony. Below them, the city lights began to flicker on. Mark looked at the city and realized Paris was not an enemy that had stolen his girlfriend. It was just a background that made their feelings look brighter. The moral of the story was simple. yet as deep as the books Mark restored in his workshop. True love is not about the absence of change or distance. It is the ability to stay true to the image of a person in your heart, even when reality tries to change it. Sometimes you need to cross an ocean and break all the rules of logic, not to test someone else, but to remind yourself that the most precious things in life don't need a perfect time. They knew that in a few days, Mark would have to fly back, and Elena would have to finish her work. But the fear was gone. Standing together under the French sky, they understood. It doesn't matter how many kilometers are on the map. What matters is that at any moment, one of them can say, "Look out your window," and the other will be there. Because home is not a place on a map or a building with an address. Home is the person who is waiting for you, even if you don't know it yet.